royal had been dead for 20 years. The attack was historical, an act of damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Somebody smashed the pharaoh's statues, took a chisel, and attempted to erase the pharaoh's name and image from history. Who was this pharaoh, and what was behind the attack? Here's the key. The pharaoh Hatshepsut was a woman. In the normal course of things, she should never have been pharaoh. Although it was legal for a woman to be a monarch, it disturbed some essential Egyptian beliefs. Firstly, the pharaoh was known as the living embodiment of the male god Horus. Secondly, disturbance to the tradition of rule by men was a serious challenge to Ma'at, a word for truth expressing a belief in order and justice, vital to the Egyptians. Hatshepsut had perhaps tried to adapt to this belief in the link between order and patriarchy through her titles. She took the name Ma'at Kare and sometimes referred to herself as Hatshepsu, with a masculine word ending. But apparently, these efforts didn't convince everyone, and perhaps someone erased Hatshepsut's image so that the world would forget the disturbance to Ma'at and Egypt could be balanced again. Hatshepsut, moreover, was not the legitimate heir to the throne, but a regent, a kind of stand-in co-monarch. The Egyptian kingship traditionally passed from father to son. It passed from Thutmose I to his son Thutmose II, Hatshepsut's husband. It should have passed from Thutmose II directly to his son Thutmose III, but Thutmose III was a little boy when his father died. Hatshepsut, the dead pharaoh's chief wife and widow, stepped in to help as her stepson's regent, but ended up ruling beside him as a fully fledged pharaoh. Perhaps Thutmose III was angry about this. Perhaps he was the one who erased her images. It's also possible that someone wanted to dishonor Hatshepsut because she was a bad pharaoh. But the evidence suggests she was actually pretty good. She competently fulfilled the traditional roles of the office. She was a great builder. Her mortuary temple, Djeser Djeseru, was an architectural phenomenon at the time and is still admired today. She enhanced the economy of Egypt, conducting a very successful trade mission to the distant land of Punt. She had strong religious connections. She even claimed to be the daughter of the state god Amun. And she had a successful military career, with a Nubian campaign and claims she fought alongside her soldiers in battle. Of course, we have to be careful when we assess the success of Hatshepsut's career, since most of the evidence was written by Hatshepsut herself. She tells her own story in pictures and writing on the walls of her mortuary temple and the red chapel she built for Amun. So who committed the crimes against Hatshepsut's memory? The most popular suspect is her stepson, nephew, and co-ruler, Thutmose III. Did he do it out of anger because she stole his throne? This is unlikely, since the damage wasn't done until 20 years after Hatshepsut died. That's a long time to hang on to anger and then act in a rage. Maybe Thutmose III did it to make his own reign look stronger, but it is most likely that he or someone else erased the images so that people would forget that a woman ever sat on Egypt's throne. This gender anomaly was simply too much of a threat to Ma'at and had to be obliterated from history. Happily, the ancient censors were not quite thorough enough.
sweltering morning in Memphis, Egypt. As the sunlight brightens the Nile, Pesachet checks her supplies: honey, garlic, cumin, acacia leaves, cedar oil. She's well stocked with the essentials she needs to treat her patients. Pesachet is a sunu, or a doctor. In order to become one, she had to train as a scribe and study the medical papyri stored at the Pur Ankh, the House of Life. Now she teaches her own students there. Before teaching, Pesachet has a patient to see. One of the workers at the temple construction site has injured his arm. When Pesachet arrives, the laborer's arm is clearly broken. And worse, the fracture is a sed with multiple bone fragments. Pesachet binds and immobilizes the injury. Her next stop is the House of Life. On her way, a woman intercepts Pesachet in the street. The woman's son has been stung by a scorpion. Pesachet has seen many similar stings and knows exactly what to do. She must say an incantation to cast the poison out. She begins to recite the spell, invoking Serket, patron of physicians and goddess of venomous creatures. Pesachet recites the spell as if she is Serket. This commanding approach has the greatest chance at success. After she utters the last line, she tries to cut the poison out with a knife, for good measure. Pesachet packs up to leave, but the woman has another question. She wants to find out if she's pregnant. Pesachet explains her fail-safe pregnancy test. Plant 2 seeds, 1 barley, 1 emmer. Then urinate on the seeds every day. If the plants grow, she's pregnant. A barley seedling predicts a baby boy, while emmer foretells a girl. Pesachet also recommends a prayer to Hathor, goddess of fertility. When Pesachet finally arrives at the House of Life, she runs into the doctor-priest Assesi. She greets Assesi politely, but she thinks priests are very full of themselves. She doesn't envy Assesi's role as Nero Pehut, which directly translates to herdsman of the anus to the royal family, or guardian of the royal anus. Inside, the House of Life is bustling as usual with scribes, priests, doctors, and students. Papyri containing all kinds of records, not just medical information, are stored here. Pesachet's son, Akhet-hetep, is hard at work copying documents as part of his training to become a scribe. He's a particularly promising student, but he was admitted to study because Pesachet is a scribe, as was her father before her. Without family in the profession, it's very difficult for boys and impossible for girls to pursue this education. Pesachet oversees all the female sunus and sunus in training in Memphis. The men have their own overseer, as the male doctors won't answer to a woman. Today, Pesachet teaches anatomy. She quizzes her students on the metu, the body's vessels that transport blood, air, urine, and even bad spirits. Pesachet is preparing to leave when a pale, thin woman accosts her at the door and begs to be examined. The woman has a huge, sore lump under her arm. Pesachet probes the growth and finds it cool to the touch and hard like an unripe hemat fruit. She has read about ailments like this but never seen one. For this tumor, there is no treatment, medicine, or spell. All the texts give the same advice: do nothing. After delivering the bad news, Pesachet goes outside. She lingers on the steps of the House of Life, admiring the city at dusk. In spite of all her hard work, there will always be patients she can't help, like the woman with the tumor. They linger with her, but Pesachet has no time to dwell. In a few short weeks, the Nile's annual flooding will begin, bringing life to the soil for the next year's harvest and a whole new crop of patients. Keep exploring the details of daily life in ancient civilizations.
Ancient Egypt food. Egypt is in Africa and the Middle East. The ancient name of Egypt is Black Earth, Kemet, meaning he received his name due to the fertility of black soil found in the plains of the Nile River flowing through Egypt. Egypt is also known for its historical monuments such as the Giza Pyramid Complex, and even the Egyptian civilization holds a lot of importance. Egypt is a country with a political and cultural significance for the Middle East. Egypt gets its English name from various sources such as Egypt word French, Latin and Greek Egyptus Aegyptos old. The basic diet of the population has remained the same for a long time. The cuisine of ancient Egyptians resemblance to the cuisine of modern Egypt. Their diet consisted of bread and beer with vegetables such as onions, garlic, fruits such as date and figure meat and wine were consumed by everyone in general, on some occasions, while the rich, very frequently. Meat, fish and poultry consumed even were either with salt or dried, cooked or roasted, grilled or even. The ancient Egyptians ate with their hands. Social status of an individual is a decisive factor in the food he can eat. The wealthy could afford a large variety of food while the poor were forced to stick to normal food they could afford. Beer and wine were the usual beverages for all classes. The diet of the poor was bread, onions and fish again. The beer was a drink that is normally consumed. The meat was rarely consumed. However, these restrictions do not appear in the case of the rich. They usually have more than 15 types of bread. Commonly used vegetables were lentils, peas, lettuce, cucumber, onions. Extracted honeybees has been used instead of sugar. Animals such as cattle, goats, sheep and pigs were the main source of obtaining meat. The rich man also had the luxury of eating dates, grapes, melons, apricots and pomegranates. Banquets were held by the rich as butter and cheese was served. They also had dancers who entertained guests. Our knowledge of everyday life in ancient Egypt has been derived largely from depictions on the walls of tombs and other written records, including thousands of fragments of limestone ostraka from the New Kingdom which include letters, legal matters and student writing exercises. Here we look at some of the information gleaned from both these sources and artifact. Many Old Kingdom tombs at Saqqara depict scenes of activities such as hunting, fishing and cattle herding. Small sculptures from the Old Kingdom also depict various activities such as bread and beer making. By the Middle Kingdom, some tombs contain wooden models of servants working in granaries, baking bread, plowing fields and sailing boats. One major wooden model in the Cairo Museum shows a landowner seated under a canopy with his officials as his stock are paraded past him. Other models illustrate workers weaving and fishing with nets suspended between boats. Ancient Egyptian food facts in the New Kingdom tombs of officials and craftsmen. Scenes often show fields being harvested, followed by the winnowing and threshing of grain. Scribes are sometimes depicted in such scenes noting the quantities of grain for the purpose of taxation. In return, the administration oversaw the construction of irrigation canals and dikes to make best use of the annual flooding of the Nile. Grape picking is shown in some paintings, and the tomb of Senfer, an 18th dynasty mayor of Thebes, modern Luxor, has a large part of its ceiling painted to depict vines and clusters of grapes. Grapes were eaten and also used for wine production, the best quality coming from the Delta region. Many types of vegetables were included in the diet, some being onions, garlic, melons and peas. They also ate plenty of fish, ducks, pigeons, geese and quail. Herodotus states that people who raised and ate pig were shunned, but archaeological evidence suggests that although technically unclean, pork was still popular with many poorer Egyptians. Likewise, fish was a fairly common element of the Egyptian diet, despite the fact that they were often considered to be unclean by wealthy Egyptians and the priesthood. Herodotus states that priests were not allowed to eat fish, and fish were rarely given as offerings to the dead. In certain areas and at certain times eating certain kinds of fish was proscribed, in the Ethiopian pharaoh Pianki, 25th dynasty, apparently refused to dine with the fish-eating noblemen of Lower Egypt because of their diet. Yet the craftsmen at Deir el-Medina had their own dedicated team of fishermen who supplied them with an amount of fish determined by their rank, and few species of fish were considered sacred. Egypt also had a lucrative trade in dried and salted fish. Because of the heat, meat and fish had to be eaten immediately or preserved by salting and brining, drying, smoking, or by the addition of honey, beer, and fish roe. Herodotus confirms that quails, ducks, and smaller birds are salted and eaten uncooked. All other kinds of birds, as well as fish, excepting those that are sacred to the Egyptians, are eaten roasted or boiled.
Symbols in Ancient Egypt. Introduction. Religion in ancient Egypt was fully integrated into the people's daily lives. The gods were present at one's birth, throughout one's life, in the transition from earthly life to the eternal, and continued their care for the soul in the afterlife of the field of reeds. The spiritual world was ever present in the physical world, and this understanding was symbolized through images in art, architecture, in amulets, statuary, and the objects used by nobility and clergy in the performance of their duties. Symbols in a largely illiterate society serve the vital purpose of relaying the most important values of the culture to the people generation after generation, and so it was in ancient Egypt. The peasant farmer would not have been able to read the literature, poetry, or hymns which told the stories of his gods, kings, and history, but could look at an obelisk or relief on a temple wall and read them there through the symbols used. An relief from the tomb of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahar showing an ankh, symbol of life, symbol of stability, and was, symbol of power. The three most important symbols, often appearing in all manner of Egyptian artwork from amulets to architecture, were the ankh, the and the scepter. These were frequently combined in inscriptions and often appear on sarcophagi together in a group or separately. In the case of each of these, the form represents the eternal value of the concept, the ankh represented life, the stability, the was power. Scholar Richard H. Wilkinson, noting the importance of form as function, relates the following. A little known but fascinating inscription made at the command of the pharaoh Thutmose IV records the discovery by the king of a stone. The significance of this celebrated stone lay not in its being of rare material or appearance, the inscription tells us, but because His Majesty found this stone in the shape of a divine hawk. That an Egyptian king should place so much importance on a mere rock simply because of its shape is instructive, for it shows how alert the ancient Egyptian was to the shapes of objects and to the symbolic importance which the dimension of form could hold. The ankh. The ankh is a cross with a loop top which, besides the concept of life, also symbolized eternal life, the morning sun, the male and female principles, the heavens and the earth. Its form embodied these concepts in its key-like shape. In carrying the ankh, one was holding the key to the secrets of existence. The union of opposites, male and female, earth and heaven, and the extension of earthly life to eternal, time to eternity, were all represented in the form of the looped cross. The symbol was so potent, and so long-lived in Egyptian culture, dating from the early dynastic period in Egypt, circa 3150 circa 2613 BCE, that it is no surprise it was appropriated by the Christian faith in the 4th century CE as a symbol for their god. The origin of the ankh symbol is unknown, but Egyptologist E. A. Wallace Budge claims it may have developed from the jet, the knot of Isis, a similar symbol with the arms at its sides associated with the goddess. Female deities were as popular, and seemed to be considered more powerful, as in the example of the goddess Neith, in the early history of Egypt, and perhaps the ankh did develop from the jet, but this theory is not universally accepted. The ankh was closely associated with the cult of Isis, however, and as her popularity grew, so did that of the symbol. Many different gods are depicted holding the ankh, and it appears, along with the symbol, in virtually every kind of Egyptian artwork from sarcophagi to tomb paintings, palace adornments, statuary, and inscriptions. As an amulet, the ankh was almost as popular as the scarab and the jt. The jt is a column with a broad base narrowing as it rises to a capital and crossed by 4 parallel lines. It first appears in the pre-dynastic period in Egypt, circa 6000 circa 3150 BCE, and remains a staple of Egyptian iconography through the Ptolemaic period, 323 to 30 BCE, the last to rule the country before the coming of Rome. Although understood as representing stability, the symbol served to remind one of the close presence of the gods, as it also referenced the god Osiris and so was linked with resurrection and eternal life. The jt was thought to represent the god's backbone and frequently appears on the bottom of sarcophagi in order to help the newly arrived soul stand up and walk into the afterlife. The symbol has also been interpreted as 4 columns rising behind each other, the tamarisk tree in which Osiris is enclosed in his most popular myth, and a fertility pole raised during festivals, but in each case, the message of the form goes back to the stability in life and hope in the afterlife, provided by the gods. In the interpretation of the symbol as 4 columns, the number most frequently appearing in Egyptian iconography is represented, 4. The number symbolized completeness and is seen in art, architecture, and funerary goods such as the 4 sons of Horus of the canopic jars, the 4 sides of a pyramid, and so on. The other interpretations likewise symbolize concepts associated with the Osiris-Isis myth. The J as the tamarisk tree speaks of rebirth and resurrection as, in the myth, the tree holds Osiris until he is freed and brought back to life by Isis. The fertility pole is also associated with Osiris, who caused the waters of the Nile River to rise, fertilize the land, and flow again to its natural course. In each case, whatever object it is claimed to represent, the J was a very powerful symbol which was often coupled with another, the was scepter. The was scepter. The was scepter is a staff topped with the head of a canine, possibly Anubis, by the time of the New Kingdom, 1570 to 1069 BCE, but earlier a totemic animal like a fox or dog. The was scepter evolved from the earliest scepters, a symbol of royal power, known as the Hecate, seen in representations of the first king, Narmer, circa 3150 BCE, of the early dynastic period, circa 3150 to 2613 BCE. By the time of the king Jet, circa 3000 to 2990 BCE, of the first dynasty, the was scepter was fully developed and symbolized one's dominion and power. The scepter was usually forked at the bottom, but this changed according to which god or mortal was holding it, and so did the color of the staff. Hathor, associated with a cow, holds the scepter forked at the bottom in the shape of cow horns. Isis holds a similar object but with the traditional fork representing duality. The was scepter of Ra-Horakhti, Horus in the horizon, god of the rising and setting sun, was blue to symbolize the sky, while that of the sun god Ra was represented with a snake attached to it, symbolizing rebirth, as the sun rose again each morning. Each god's was scepter denoted their particular dominion in one way or another. The god Ptah, from the early dynastic period, holds a was scepter which combines all 3 symbols, the Ankh, J, and was, with a circle at the bottom symbolizing unity. The combination of the symbols, naturally, combined their power, which was only fitting for this god who was associated with creation and known as the sculptor of the earth. The 3 symbols at the top of Ptah's staff, along with the circle at the bottom, presented the overall meaning of completeness, totality, in the number 4. Scarab. The scarab is the famous beetle image seen in Egyptian art and iconography, which represents the Scarabaeus caesar, a species of the dung beetle. The dung beetle was associated with the gods because it rolled dung into a ball in which it laid its eggs. The dung served as food for the young when they hatched. In this way, life came from death. Scarab-shaped amulet containing the image and cartouche of Amenhotep III, promising its owner in this world life, represented by an ankh. They were closely identified with the god Khepri, who was thought to roll the ball of the sun across the sky, keep it safe in its travels through the underworld, and push it up into the dawn the next day. When Ra became the preeminent sun god, Khepri continued in this role as an assistant. Scarabs became popular amulets during the first intermediate period, 2181 to 2040 BCE, and remained so for the duration of Egypt's history until the rise of Christianity. The Jet. The Jet, Tayet, Tayet, also known as the knot of Isis and the blood of Isis, resembles an ankh with the arms at its side. The symbol dates to the Old Kingdom of Egypt, circa 2613 circa 2181 BCE, but is probably older. The Jet has been interpreted as female genitalia, the folds of a woman's dress, and the knot of a girdle, but, in every case, is associated with the goddess Isis. Detail of the upper margin of the sarcophagus of the last native Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo II, showing the so-called J and Tayet symbols. The J, a pillar-like symbol, represents the backbone, spine, of Osiris, the god of the underworld and afterlife. It actually reflects stability. The Tayet, which resembles an ankh except that its arms are curved down, is connected to goddess Isis, and is called the knot of Isis. 30th Dynasty, Reign of Nectanebo II, circa 360 to 343 BCE. From Etrine Mosque at Alexandria, originally from Samanid, Egypt. It represented protection and security and was often paired with the Ankh, thus offering the dual security of both Isis and Osiris. The jet was frequently carved on bedposts and the walls of temples and was most popular during the time of the New Kingdom of Egypt when the cult of Isis was at its peak. The crook and flail. The crook and flail are among the most famous symbols from ancient Egypt, symbolizing the power and majesty of the king. Both these items were associated with Osiris and symbolized his early rule of the land. The symbols appear in the early dynastic period during the reign of the first king, Narmer, circa 3150 BCE, and link the king with the mythical first king of Egypt, Osiris. According to the myth, Osiris' kingdom was usurped by Set, who murdered him, but he was resurrected by his sister wife Isis. She bore him a son, Horus, who defeated Set and restored order to the land. The king was associated with Horus, with some exceptions, during life and with Osiris in death. Once Horus avenged his father and defeated Set, he took the crook and flail of his father to represent the legitimacy of his reign, and so it was for the kings of Egypt who identified with these gods. The crook was an early tool used by shepherds, while the flail was a means of herding goats and also harvesting an aromatic shrub known as the labdanum. Since Osiris was originally an agricultural, fertility deity, he was associated with both implements from the pre-dynastic period, and they served as reminders of the past and the importance of tradition, as well as, obviously, symbols of the legitimacy and power of the king. The shen. The shen is a circle of rope, knotted, to form an unbroken circle symbolizing completeness, infinity, and serving as protection. The name comes from the Egyptian word for encircle. Shin amulets were frequently worn for protection, and shin images appear on a kind of stand, the whole resembling the Greek omega, though this stand should be understood as the knotted rope completing the circle. This is a fragment of limestone stele. The relief depicts Pacer, red coloring, and his wife. Both sit on same backed lion-legged chair. They look to the right side at their daughter, who stands at the right side and holds a lotus over a table of offerings. Both females bear the name of Merit. At the upper part, there are wedge-jawed eyes flanking a shin ring. From Egypt, precise provenance of excavation is unknown. 18th dynasty, 1543 to 1292 BCE. The shin probably developed during the Old Kingdom or First Intermediate period of Egypt, but became popular during the Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1782 BCE, and remained so. The god Horus and the goddesses Nukbat and Isis are frequently seen holding the shin, but other gods are also associated with the symbol. The shin appears on sarcophagi and in temples and tombs, as well as personal inscriptions. The Egyptians greatly valued symmetry and completeness, and so the shin was quite popular and often represented. The Ajat eye. The Ajat is another well-known symbol from Egypt, the Eye of Ra. The symbol of the eye is associated with the protective goddess Wajet during the pre-dynastic period and continued to be, even though it was later more regularly linked to Horus, Ra, and others through the motif of the distant goddess. The distant goddess story has many forms in Egyptian mythology, but one consistent plot: a goddess in some way rebels against the king of the gods, leaves her home and responsibilities behind to journey to a far-off land and must be brought back, or tricked into returning, thus initiating some kind of transformation. The Ajat either represented the goddess or was sent to retrieve her and could take many forms. As the Eye of Ra, it was understood to symbolize his watchful presence over creation and is frequently depicted in myths, like those of the distant goddess, being sent forth to gather information for Ra. The Ajat remained a consistently potent symbol throughout Egypt's history. The sezon. The sezon is the lotus flower which appears so often in Egyptian art and symbolizes life, creation, rebirth and, especially, the sun. The symbol dates to the early dynastic period but became most popular from the Old Kingdom onwards. The lotus flower closes at evening and sinks down beneath the water, then at daybreak, it emerges to open again. This pattern identified it with the sun and, therefore, with life. This painted wooden stela depicts a man, His name is identified as Ihephi and his title was the doorkeeper of the house of Ammon, adoring the hawk-headed god Horus. Horus sits on a throne and holds a flail. There is a red and blue lotus bloom over a yellow stand in the middle of the scene. From Egypt, 22nd Dynasty, 945 to 720 BCE. The Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, London, with thanks to the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, UCL. The flower also represented rebirth for the same reason and was associated with the god Osiris. The four sons of Horus, regularly represented on canopic jars, are often depicted standing together on a lotus in the presence of Osiris. The lotus flower appears in many different types of Egyptian art, from faience statuary to sarcophagi, temples, shrines, and on amulets. It was the symbol of Upper Egypt, as the papyrus plant symbolized Lower Egypt, and the flower is sometimes depicted with its stem entwined with that of the papyrus plant. The Benben. The Benben was the primordial mound upon which the god Atum stood at the beginning of creation. It is easily the best known symbol from ancient Egypt, after the Ankh, even if one does not recognize the name. The pyramids of Egypt, wherever one finds them and from any age, represent the Benben as they rise from the earth toward the heavens. The pyramids of Giza, Egypt. The earliest and largest is the Great Pyramid built by Khufu, 2589 to 2566 BCE, and one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. According to one version of the Egyptian creation myth, in the beginning of time, there were only the dark waters of chaos in constant motion until the Benben rose as the first dry land. Atum, or in some stories Ptah or Ra, stood on the Benben to begin the work of creation. The pyramids and other similar structures symbolized both creation and eternity by invoking the imagery of this myth. The Benben as a symbol dates from the early dynastic period but became more widespread during the Old Kingdom, the time of the Great Pyramid builders when the monuments at Giza were constructed. It may have been worn as an amulet but more likely was among the works of art mass-produced during the First Intermediate period as a statuette. The Benben appears in many inscriptions from the Old Kingdom through the Late Period, circa 525 to 323 BCE, and was also engraved on temple walls, tombs, and sarcophagi. Other symbols. There were many other important symbols throughout Egypt's history. The Bennu bird, for example, was the model for the Greek phoenix, and symbolized resurrection. The white ostrich feather symbolized the goddess Maut but also the concept of balance and truth she stood for. The tree of life stood for knowledge, purpose, and destiny. Snakes and serpents represented transformation and change. The cobra was a protective image, associated early with the goddess Wajet, who drove off the enemies of Ra. With hood extended and rearing to strike, the cobra became the insignia of kings and was worn on the uraeus, the royal headdress. The crowns of Egypt in art also have distinct meaning and symbolism. The red crown, Tishrit, symbolized Lower Egypt, the white crown, Hadjet, Upper Egypt, and the red and white double crown, Shant, a unified Egypt. Images of the king in battle show him in a blue crown, a kepresh, invoking the power of the Nile River and the heavens through its color. The god Osiris had his own crown, the Tef, a tall head-jet crown adorned on each side with ostrich feathers and topped by a gold sun disk. All of these symbols contributed to the rich culture of ancient Egypt and, although they were religious in nature, were never considered religious symbols as a modern mind would interpret the term. In the present day, especially in Western countries, religion is considered a separate sphere, distinct from one's role in secular society, but in Egypt, there was no such separation. The priests and priestesses of the Egyptian deities, the kings, scribes, and nobility made use of these symbols regularly, of course, but they appear as amulets, inscriptions, and on statuary of every class of Egyptian society from the greatest king to the most modest member of a community.
Weltering morning in Memphis, Egypt. As the sunlight brightens the Nile, Pesachet checks her supplies. Honey, garlic, cumin, acacia leaves, cedar oil. She's well stocked with the essentials she needs to treat her patients. Pesachet is a sunu, or a doctor. In order to become one, she had to train as a scribe and study the medical papyri stored at the Per Ankh, the House of Life. Now she teaches her own students there. Before teaching, Pesachet has a patient to see. One of the workers at the temple construction site has injured his arm. When Pesachet arrives, the laborer's arm is clearly broken. And worse, the fracture is a sed with multiple bone fragments. Pesachet binds and immobilizes the injury. Her next stop is the House of Life. On her way, a woman intercepts Pesachet in the street. The woman's son has been stung by a scorpion. Pesachet has seen many similar stings and knows exactly what to do. She must say an incantation to cast the poison out. She begins to recite the spell, invoking Serket, patron of physicians and goddess of venomous creatures. Pesachet recites the spell as if she is Serket. This commanding approach has the greatest chance at success. After she utters the last line, she tries to cut the poison out with a knife, for good measure. Pesachet packs up to leave, but the woman has another question. She wants to find out if she's pregnant. Pesachet explains her fail-safe pregnancy test. Plant 2 seeds, 1 barley, 1 emmer. Then urinate on the seeds every day. If the plants grow, she's pregnant. A barley seedling predicts a baby boy, while emmer foretells a girl. Pesachet also recommends a prayer to Hathor, goddess of fertility. When Pesachet finally arrives at the House of Life, she runs into the doctor-priest Assesi. She greets Assesi politely, but she thinks priests are very full of themselves. She doesn't envy Assesi's role as Nero Pehut, which directly translates to herdsman of the anus to the royal family, or guardian of the royal anus. Inside, the House of Life is bustling as usual with scribes, priests, doctors, and students. Papyri containing all kinds of records, not just medical information, are stored here. Pesachet's son, Akhet-hetep, is hard at work copying documents as part of his training to become a scribe. He's a particularly promising student, but he was admitted to study because Pesachet is a scribe, as was her father before her. Without family in the profession, it's very difficult for boys and impossible for girls to pursue this education. Pesachet oversees all the female Sunus and Sunus in training in Memphis. The men have their own overseer, as the male doctors won't answer to a woman. Today, Pesachet teaches anatomy. She quizzes her students on the metu, the body's vessels that transport blood, air, urine, and even bad spirits. Pesachet is preparing to leave when a pale, thin woman accosts her at the door and begs to be examined. The woman has a huge, sore lump under her arm. Pesachet probes the growth and finds it cool to the touch and hard like an unripe hemat fruit. She has read about ailments like this but never seen one. For this tumor, there is no treatment, medicine, or spell. All the texts give the same advice: do nothing. After delivering the bad news, Pesachet goes outside. She lingers on the steps of the House of Life, admiring the city at dusk. In spite of all her hard work, there will always be patients she can't help, like the woman with the tumor. They linger with her, but Pesachet has no time to dwell. In a few short weeks, the Nile's annual flooding will begin, bringing life to the soil for the next year's harvest and a whole new crop of patients. Keep exploring the details of daily life in ancient civilizations.
Ani stands before a large golden scale where the jackal-headed god Anubis is weighing his heart against a pure ostrich feather. Ani was a real person, a scribe from the Egyptian city of Thebes who lived in the 13th century BCE. And depicted here is a scene from his Book of the Dead, a 78-foot papyrus scroll designed to help him attain immortality. Such funerary texts were originally written only for pharaohs, but with time, the Egyptians came to believe regular people could also reach the afterlife if they succeeded in the passage. Ani's epic journey begins with his death. His body is mummified by a team of priests who remove every organ except the heart, the seat of emotion, memory, and intelligence. It's then stuffed with a salt called natron and wrapped in resin-soaked linen. In addition, the wrappings are woven with charms for protection and topped with a heart scarab amulet that will prove important later on. The goal of the 2-month process is to preserve Ani's body as an ideal form with which his spirit can eventually reunite. But first, that spirit must pass through the Duat, or underworld. This is a realm of vast caverns, lakes of fire, and magical gates, all guarded by fearsome beasts. Snakes, crocodiles, and half-human monstrosities with names like He Who Dances in Blood. To make things worse, Apep, the serpent god of destruction, lurks in the shadows, waiting to swallow Ani's soul. Fortunately, Ani is prepared with the magic contained within his Book of the Dead. Like other Egyptians who could afford it, Ani customized his scroll to include the particular spells, prayers, and codes he thought his spirit might need. Equipped with this arsenal, our hero traverses the obstacles, repels the monster's attacks, and stealthily avoids Apep to reach the hall of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. Here, Ani faces his final challenge. He is judged by 42 assessor gods, who must be convinced that he has lived a righteous life. Ani approaches each one, addressing them by name and declaring a sin he has not committed. Among these negative confessions, or declarations of innocence, he proclaims that he has not made anyone cry, is not an eavesdropper, and has not polluted the water. But did Ani really live such a perfect life? Not quite, but that's where the heart scarab amulet comes in. It's inscribed with the words, "Do not stand as a witness against me," precisely so Ani's heart doesn't betray him by recalling the time he listened to his neighbor's fight or washed his feet in the Nile. Now it's Ani's moment of truth, the weighing of the heart. If his heart is heavier than the feather, weighed down by Ani's wrongdoings, it'll be devoured by the monstrous Amit, part crocodile, part leopard, part hippopotamus, and Ani will cease to exist forever. But Ani is in luck. His heart is judged pure. Ra, the sun god, takes him to Osiris, god of the underworld, who gives him final approval to enter the afterlife. In the endless and lush field of reeds, Ani meets his deceased parents. Here there is no sadness, pain, or anger, but there is work to be done. Like everyone else, Ani must cultivate a plot of land. which he does with the help of a Shabti doll that had been placed in his tomb. Today, the papyrus of Ani resides in the British Museum, where it has been since 1888. Only Ani, if anyone, knows what really happened after his death. But thanks to his Book of the Dead, we can imagine.
The ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for over 3,000 years and became one of the most powerful and iconic civilizations in history. At its height, ancient Egypt's empire stretched as far north as modern-day Syria and as far south as today's Sudan. But long before it was an empire, ancient Egypt was a series of small, independent city-states that bloomed along North Africa's Nile River. The city-states were divided into two regions and named according to the flow of the Nile: Upper Egypt in the south, which was upstream, and Lower Egypt in the north, which was downstream. By about 3100 BC, the two halves united, thereby creating one Egyptian state that lasted for millennia. The reign of this civilization can be divided into three major periods of prosperity, called the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, and two periods of instability in between, called the First and Second Intermediate Periods. Guiding the Egyptian people was a succession of about 300 rulers, often referred to as pharaohs. Pharaoh, which means great house in Egyptian, was never the ruler's formal title. It only became synonymous with the ruling individual in modern times, thanks to its use in the Hebrew Bible. These rulers, who were not always men, nor Egyptian, were considered protectors of the people and served as divine liaisons between humanity and the hundreds of gods they worshipped. After the rulers passed away, ancient Egyptians believed they then became gods. To prepare their journey into the afterlife, the rulers constructed elaborate tombs, including the Great Pyramids at Giza and underground mausoleums in the Valley of the Kings. Rulers filled their tombs with all the items they could need in the afterlife, including gold, jewelry, food, drink, and even pets. Preparing for this journey to the gods also involved mummifying one's body. The deceased's corpse was embalmed, wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, and placed inside the tomb so the body could be reanimated in the afterlife. To this day, structures like the Great Pyramids are a testament to the role of religion in ancient Egyptians' lives. But they also represent the innovative and cultural might of the Egyptian people. Innovations in mathematics and written language in particular propelled their civilization to success. Math, specifically measurement mathematics, helped Egyptians understand and harness their world with numbers like no other civilization had before. They developed a new form of measurement called the cubit. It was used to design massive structures, such as the Great Pyramid, with remarkable geometrical precision. The Egyptians also measured time. By combining mathematics with astronomy, they established a 24-hour division to the day and created a solar calendar, which was the first dating system in history to feature 365 days in one year. Lastly, Egyptians developed methods to measure and survey land around the Nile River. These civil engineering feats made way for the construction of dams, canals, and irrigation systems that helped farming and agriculture to flourish in the Nile Valley. In addition to mathematical concepts, the ancient Egyptians also created written languages to describe the world around them. The oldest and probably most well-known of these is hieroglyphic writing. This system was developed around 3150 BC during the Old Kingdom and has over 700 pictorial characters. It was used to inscribe monuments and pottery and predominantly served a decorative or ceremonial purpose. Soon after, another ancient form of writing, called hieratic, developed out of the hieroglyphic system. It was a form of cursive that was written in ink and served a more functional purpose. Unlike its more formal predecessor, hieratic was written on another ancient Egyptian innovation, papyrus. Papyrus was a type of paper derived from the papyrus plant, which grew plentifully along the Nile River. This medium gave the ancient Egyptians a new avenue of communication and record-keeping that allowed their civilization's administrative skill to grow and their culture to spread for thousands of years. As with all great empires, ancient Egypt came to an end. It was eventually conquered after a series of invasions, including those by the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC and the Roman Empire around 30 BC. Not many civilizations can claim a lifespan of over 3,000 years, let alone one that made vast cultural contributions that still resonate in modern times. Ancient Egypt, with its linguistic and mathematical innovations, spirituality and religion, and extensive political and military